I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We are particularly pleased to have this round table or rectangular table symposium here this morning on a very current issue that is getting a lot of attention in the region and in the media. It involves relations between a great island nation and a great continental power, two countries that have for thousands of years been interacting with each other, in many cases in very positive ways, with very significant cultural interchanges between them, and in some cases in very negative ways, giving rise to great conflicts. I was a student of history in college, and the issue that we will be discussing today is an issue that is wrapped up in history. History can help us to understand the problem, but history also greatly complicates the problem of finding mutually satisfactory outcomes. That's why I think it is so important that we have this opportunity to look at the issue from a scholarly standpoint. Now, ideally, scholars, of course, are above national passions. They are only concerned about collecting the evidence and sifting it as objectively as possible. On the other hand, scholars tend to be human beings, meaning that they are not immune to the effects of national passions. This group, however, I think has approached the issue in exactly the right way. It's a serious problem. It's a problem that deserves to have knowledgeable people on both sides sit down together and try to sort through the nature of the problem, looking for ways that can manage the issue so that the important relations between China and Japan are not held hostage to a group of unoccupied islands in the East China Sea that have been so insignificant in the past that that's one of the contributing factors to the existence of the problem, because the historical records on both sides show some inconsistencies simply because other problems were more important to the governments at the time, and therefore they left a somewhat inconsistent record behind. If I have misspoken on this issue, it will be corrected during the discussion, but I think that we can all benefit from the exchanges that have already taken place and that will take place from now on. Thank you very much. And Dean, would you like to say something?
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I was asked to speak for 2 minutes, so I'll be happy to do so. I'm Andrea Bacci, I'm the Dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And I'm delighted that Ambassador Tepelon-Roy invited us here at the Wilson Center, because I think that Washington has a responsibility to listen carefully and learn. And sometimes when we are busy or taken by many tasks, it's difficult to listen and learn. It's not difficult only for the parties, it's difficult for everybody. To listen and learn, we need time. We also need an atmosphere that allows us to learn. It's difficult to learn when we are in a rush. It's difficult to learn when we are running elsewhere. It's difficult to learn when we are not paying attention. Yesterday, many of the participants were at Point of View, a wonderful property in Lorton, Virginia, just 20 miles from here, listening to one another and learning from one another. I think that the spirit of this listening and learning is particularly important when disagreements are there. A disagreement can be an invitation. There are differences all around us all the time. Male, female, young and old, rich and poor. What are we going to do? Are we going to exacerbate those differences? Are we going to make those differences a conflict? how we make those differences so entrenched and impossible to overcome that it's not even possible to talk about them? Are we going to use them so intensely that we will refuse to be present to one another through the word that we are saying? Or, as the guests and the participants to this workshop, and to all of you today, we use them as an opportunity to talk again, to learn again, to listen again, to be closer together, because no solution that is intelligent and responsible will ever come out without the listening and without the learning. So I really welcome this opportunity and this moment as an opportunity for all of us to say to one another, yes, the issue that we are facing today is strongly, forcibly shaped by history. But we make our history. History doesn't make us. We have choices to make. And choices can be made competently, attentively, carefully. If we are present to one another and we use words properly, we can find something that is not there yet. The responsibility of our time together is indeed to respectfully acknowledge the differences and make sure that these differences are listened, appreciated, understood, and that we, all of us, from Washington to everywhere in the world, participate in this process responsibly. Welcome. Thank you very much.
We are now going to hear brief summaries of the discussions that have taken place already, followed by the first panel, after which we will break for some refreshments, and then we will resume again for the second panel. Yeah. We will yield our seats to the two summarizers.
Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Zheng Wang. I'm currently a public policy scholar at Wilson Center. I'm one of the organizers of this event. And so before we move to the panel discussion, myself and my colleague, Dr. Roy, we will just briefly introduce you why we organized this event and what we have discussed yesterday during our closed-door dialogue. First, thank you very much for coming. You know, in Chinese, there's a saying goes like that, all the good things come with some hardship. So it's unfortunately, we have to cancel this morning's public forum. We have prepared it for so long. But fortunately, we still be able to come here, and we decided we still do the same thing as a public forum. So we will have two panel discussion. And first, I want to really thank Ambassador Roy, thank Wilson Center, thank Bob, and thank the George Mason University for your very important support for this program that we are able to do that. And we also want to thank our panelists. Each of them, they are very busy scholars, and they decided to come here to join us to conduct this dialogue. The original ideas between two of us when we planned to have this dialogue is that I'm originally from China, and Tats come from Japan. We are actually classmates in the PhD program. It's so sad to say the bilateral relationship between these two big Asian neighbors. At the year, they actually supposed to celebrate the 40 years normalization of their relationship. The bilateral relationship almost collapsed. And we also noticed the reason we say this relationship is really very dangerous is that both governments, they are in the situation because the rise of nationalism and domestic politics at home, they have a very limited flexibility of do anything. any compromise may appear as weak and may not pass domestic politics. So at this situation, we think that as scholars, we have been spending all of time to work on the relationship. We should do something and to talk with each other. And we also noticed that there's a huge perception gap between the two countries. Like what we discussed during the closed-door dialogue yesterday, we found almost everything. The two countries, we see it totally different. Each side consider themselves as the victim, and the other side, they are the aggressor. They take the aggressive behavior to change the status quo. And we are peace-loving country. So, and almost everything, they have totally different ideas, different interpretations. So I think that also highlights the importance we conduct this, this dialogue. And also, another very important thing is that basically when we talk about the normalization of the relationship, it's basically, if we compare it with China-Japan relationship with German-Poland, German-France relationship, we can notice there's one major difference is that the two countries has never realized a real reconciliation between two societies. That's the reason they always got problems, because the normalization is realized as a top-down arrangement. So we think it's necessary that we do something not from top down. Maybe we can call our activities as a kind of middle out. And the one thing I want to clarify here is that we call it a China-Japan dialogue, but it's not really kind of like between two countries, two governments, or any two organizations. Each of the participants for this dialogue, we only represent ourselves. We don't have any special mission. We are just some concerned scholars. We want to do something to improve the mutual understanding. So that is something I want to clarify. So now I want to ask my colleague to talk more about the, the program.
Okay. So my name is Tatsushi Arai. I am a visiting scholar at George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, also Associate Professor of Peace Building and Conflict Transformation at the School for International Training Graduate Institute in Vermont. I am very happy to work on this initiative together with my classmate and longtime friend, Jen Wan. Without this personal friendship, this did not come into fruition. My role here is simply to spend a few minutes, very briefly, to talk about the process through which the panelists who come forward here arrived at what they are going to say. It's not only the existing scholarship, enormous scholarship both sides have, but the dialogue we held from morning to evening until dinner time yesterday. What we aspire to do is interactive conflict resolution, or ICR. ICR, in a nutshell, is a sustained process of sharing conflict as a shared challenge, seeing a conflict as a shared challenge. People, individuals from societies on different sides of the conflict coming together to look at that shared challenge from multiple angles in a systematic way, and jointly exploring possible ways to transform or manage the underlying roots of that difference, and importantly, building relationship as human beings. And that's exactly what we try to do between the two sides. Concretely, we divided the complex nature of the issues into the history, security, politics, culture, economics, and when we say culture, we did include identity. And then toward the end, we all got together to jointly really brainstorm approaches to conflict resolution. Brainstorm. So we'll see that the two sets of panelists, each will be very brief with a view towards securing as much time as possible for open questions and answers, true to the title we gave to this forum, which is China-Japan Dialogue, open to everybody. And the first panel would more or less talk about what is this conflict about? What is this crisis about? Where is it coming from? The second panel would talk more or less about what can we do about it. But of course, what we can do about it is never distinguished completely from how we understand what this situation is about. So the second panelist would also continue a little bit of discussion as to how they view the current situation from economic perspective, historical perspective, security perspective, conflict scholars perspective, and all different kinds of perspectives. I apologize in advance. They say Japanese people apologize all the time before the event. I'm no exception to it. We did our best to have a good gender balance, but with the exception of a very competent hand of Dr. Wu, who will introduce, I think we have one lady who will be represented at the panel, but our spirit is inclusive of gender, regions, different identities, and so on and so forth. So with that acknowledgement, we start.
Okay, so we move to the...
Yes, okay.
Okay, so may I ask our first panel to move in the front, and yeah, we are sorry because we changed the room, so we have to make some, this kind of temporary arrangements. Maybe, okay, we just follow this order. You go second, okay. First, just let me to introduce the panelists in our first panel. As Tats mentioned, our first panel will focus more about the current situation or something related with history. We're fortunate we have three top scholars in the field. I just starting from Professor Da-Chin Yang. He's a professor of the George Washington University, and he's a historian. He's, I think, the only person I have ever met. He speaks Chinese, Japanese, English, all as native. So he kind of like can switch channel freely. And Dr. Shinju Fujihiro, and he's the Associate Director of the U.S.-Japan Relations Program at the Weatherhead Center, Harvard University. And Dr. Junhua Wu, he's currently a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, but she has a lengthy working experience in Japan, in Hong Kong, in China, and also in the United States. So I think because we changed somehow our, we canceled our morning's program. So we want to make it this way. I will ask a question to the panel and ask actually the same question. I asked each of them to give their comments. The question is, we know that there's the two countries, now they have tensions. So what's this tension really about? We know they are somehow fighting for several rocks in the East China Sea. But what's really underlying these disputes? Is this really a dispute over some small islands? Or it's about really kind of extension of domestic politics? Or it's really just a historic issue, never settled? Or this probably is a kind of like economic, but this country is obviously that they have the huge common interest. But why they somehow forget about their common interest and they are somehow developed in such kind of situations? So we have historian, we have the political scientist, and we have economist, and we want to hear their comments. How about we start from Da-Chin?
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. In their introductory remarks, Ambassador Roy mentioned that history plays a central role in this current dispute. Dean Bertolli added that history doesn't have to make us, we can make history, and difference can be overcome. As a historian, I agree with them both. In my 5 minutes, I would like to offer some brief historical perspectives, and especially on the question, what are the differences? I think it's important for us to understand the difference first before we can think of ways of overcoming them. You can read several of the very authoritative sources on this question, refer you to foreign ministry websites, white papers, or advertisements placed in the newspaper by concerned governments, Japan, People's Republic of China, Republic of China on Taiwan. And also there is a very good Congressional Research Service report published last year on this very issue. It seems to me the dispute boils down to two fundamental questions. The first, Japan and PRC as well as ROC all claim Senkaku Diaoyutai, different names for the same group of islands, as its sovereign territory. Second, Japan and PRC disagree whether there was a tacit agreement to shelve the dispute in 1972 and later. So let me just go into a little bit detail on each of these disputes. The first dispute over sovereignty. Basically, Japan's position is this. First, Japan legally annexed the islands in 1895 based on the principle of terra nullius. Essentially, they were no man's land. Second, sovereignty has resided with Japan ever since, even when they were under US administration before they were returned with Okinawa to Japan in 1971. Third, China, this is either Republic of China or People's Republic of China, did not raise any objections until 1971, and this is after possible oil gas deposits were discovered a few years before. Now let me turn to the China side. To simplify issues, I will mainly refer to People's Republic of China, although I'd like to remind us that Republic of China, in fact, at the beginning was a main player in this dispute. So for the Chinese, official Chinese view is that the islands have been China's territory ever since at least the Ming and Qing times, 15th century or later. Then Japan legally annexed the islands after it had defeated Qing China during the war in early 1895, and later renaming them Senkaku, which were actually based on a 19th century British name. And these islands should have been returned to China after World War II, according to the Cairo Declaration of 1943, and upheld in the Potsdam Declaration. Now, many have addressed the issue, what are the underlying problems, such as the ambiguity of the post-World War II settlement, but I'd like to highlight two other issues. One is the different views of history behind these official narratives. I think on the China side, it tends to see this episode of annexation as part of unrelenting Japanese expansion in the modern times at the expense of its Asian neighbors. And for Japan, the official view, again, this is a lawful territorial consolidation separate from colonial expansion. Now this view, for those of you who know, is somewhat similar to the view also concerning the Dokdo-Takeshima dispute. The second is the different views of sovereignty and boundary. As you know, that in traditional East Asia, there was a different regime governing interstate relations that is different from the modern Westphalian concept of sovereignty. For instance, the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is today's Okinawa, was paying tribute to both China and Satsuma Han with Japan. And this is something unthinkable in the Westphalian system. And also, there were evolving international maritime regimes concerning maritime boundaries, such as the United Nations Law of the Sea, as well as issues like exclusive economic zones, which did not exist, obviously, in the late 19th century. Now, the second dispute over what I call the tacit agreement is a more recent history. In this case, the Chinese view is that there was a tacit agreement between Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue and Premier Zhou Enlai during the normalization talks in 1972 to shelve the island issue. And later, Chinese Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping confirmed this at a press conference in Japan in late 1978, and he suggested leaving this issue to future generations who are wiser than us. Now in Japan, the government view, especially in recent years, is no such tacit, unstated agreement with PRC over the island ever existed. Now I should add there are other views in Japan that admit a vague tacit agreement. Some were even expressed by former high-ranking government officials, business leaders, and scholars. And there are others who acknowledge that Japan should acknowledge the existence of a dispute, if it's diplomatic dispute, at least. Of course, on this question, I think there are possible causes. First of all, that is the nature of any unspoken tacit agreement, especially negotiated under trustful relationship among the key players who have now disappeared from the scene. And second, there is the issue of the institutional memory, especially the changing from the LDP government to DPJ government in Japan. And then as a historian, I also want to emphasize that the records of these negotiations are by no means complete. Now, Japan has declassified the records of the negotiation in 1972. It is only recent that the PRC has quoted, though not declassified, from their record. And the Japanese record essentially has one round of brief conversation between the two principals, whereas the Chinese version were slightly longer. The reason given to this is that the Chinese side had better stenographers, whereas the Japanese were kept by diplomats. Now, this could exacerbate some of the misunderstandings or disagreement. I'll conclude my remarks here, and I'll turn to my colleagues.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yang. And now we invite the Professor Fujihira to give his comments.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be in this panel. My paper is the most political of all, and the argument I make is actually very similar to what Dr. Wang said in his introductory remarks. That is that what's very distinctive about this current round of sort of crisis is that both sides have completely different versions, completely different perceptions of who is at fault, who is the, let's say, the aggressor and the victim, and who is trying to change the status quo. And the argument I make in the paper, I emphasize this idea of domestic audience. That is that political leaders who make consequential foreign policy decisions are also sort of elected or chosen at home, and they see the need to appeal to domestic audience. And in that process, they develop a narrative of ongoing events, which then tend to escalate the crisis over time. So with my limited time, I'll talk about the 2010 September crisis. And if I have time, I'll talk also about 2012. So I think in the September 2010, the trawler captain ramming the two Japan Coast Guard ships on September 7th, 2010, it was consequential, in my view, that the DPJ was in power, Democratic Party of Japan, and that Prime Minister Naoto Kan was in power. So the DPJ had won a landslide victory in August of 2009, and under the prime ministership of Yukio Hatoyama, varieties of, I think, issues, particularly with regards to the relocation of the Futema Marine Air Station, led to uncertainties about U.S.-Japan alliance. There's also a kind of reaching out to China. And this crisis happened exactly 3 months after Prime Minister Kan had taken office. He was facing his own presidential election in the DPJ in about a week. So he delegated this issue to Chief Cabinet Secretary Sengoku and Minister of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, Seiji Maehara. Now, what's distinctive about the ways in which these two individuals dealt with the crisis is that they emphasized the language of rule of law. They emphasized the language of what they called, solemnly apply the domestic law. So, 粛々と国内法を適用する. They also emphasized that there is no territorial problem. So, 領土問題は存在しない. And this posed a challenge to the Chinese political leadership. And one sort of hypothesis is that this is really the first time in which it was exposed that the Chinese side actually did not have effective control, effective administrative control over these islands to the Chinese public. And so as the detention of the trawler captain continued, initially until September 19th, and then eventually again extended, initially for another 10 days. This is the sort of the pattern in which the escalation took place. On the Chinese side also, there was the 5th plenary session of the 17th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think in order to understand what the Japanese perceived as really an over-the-top reaction, which is embargo of the rare earth metals, the detention of the 4 employees of the Fujita Corporation and so on. I think there is that domestic political dynamic which is very important. Similarly, I wouldn't really go in much detail, but in the 2012, the sort of purchase of the islands, what's distinctive there is that the Japanese side thinks that this was completely reasonable. This was the second best option. And they think of this as a domestic commercial transaction. Whereas on the Chinese side, it is seen as a conspiracy. That is, initially it was the owner of the islands and then Tokyo Governor Ishihara. But now Noda was in some ways kind of getting together with them and ended up this so-called nationalization of the islands. And again, I think there was a domestic political dynamic here. I think on Noda and the DPJ side, they knew they were facing a House of Representatives election. They did not want to be criticized for not sort of being able to deal with territorial problems. And Noda himself actually was facing his own presidential election in September within a DPJ. I think on the Chinese side, there was this unprecedented 18th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which had a lot of political uncertainty and is a major political leadership transition. And so one of the things I would mention is that, I think in the Japanese side, it was reported that Prime Minister Noda's logic was that Japan wanted to handle this matter before the new leadership of Xi Jinping were to take office. But from the Chinese perspective, this happened right in the middle of a preparation for the 18th National Congress. And they just really did not want this to be taking place. So again, completely different perceptions. It's sort of, completely different sort of, in some ways, lack of understanding about how domestic politics in each country works and different logics that each side applied. So in conclusion, I think I think of this problem as a political problem. And so ability to rebuild China-Japan relationship really depends today, in the short run, on the ability for the Abe administration and the Xi Jinping administration to build legitimacy at home. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Fujihira. And now we listen to Dr. Wu for her comments.
And it's my great pleasure to be here. I would like to approach this issue from economic aspect. Until recent year, economic ties has been a very important factor that is supporting two countries' stability. Just like a popular phrase describes that, warm economic ties called political relations. In Chinese, 正冷经热, in Japanese, 塞勒开热子. But this time, it's different. This time, I think the economic factor has played a pivotal role in escalating the two countries' confrontation. Ostensibly, this crisis was triggered by former governor of Tokyo, Ishihara Shintaro's plan to buy Diaoyu Senkaku Island. But from my view, I think it's not the real reason. The real reason is power of balance between China and Japan has shifted from favoring Japan to China. And the main force that made this shift was Sino-Japanese economic integration. As previous territorial dispute showed that, if the balance of the power between China and Japan had remained at the same level as before, China might have reacted just as strongly to Japan, but it would at least not to risk the outbreak of the war against it. Looking back at the development of this crisis, we can see a lot of discussion about economic interdependence from both sides. In Japanese business society, there have been growing concerns that territorial dispute would have negative impact on the business of Japanese companies in China. But in China, while some industry insiders and scholars contended that anti-Japanese sentiment, especially imposing economic sanction or waging an economic war against Japan, may drive down China's foreign investment and possibly add new risks to the already slowed Chinese economy. The dominant opinions have been quite positive about the influence of anti-Japanese sentiment to the Chinese economy, such as the idea like that China is capable of mounting a heavy blow to the Japanese economy without hurting itself too much. Japan relies heavily on the China market to keep its economic afloat. People's Daily even declared that Japan's economy lacks immunity to Chinese economic measures. Why they are so confident? I think because they believe that high economic growth and economic integration between China and Japan have greatly enhanced China's strength. Indeed, along with the rise of its economic strength, China has gained many advantages, such as the world's biggest nation of foreign exchange reserves and one of the fast expanding domestic market. As a result, Sino-Japanese economic relations have experienced dynamic change accordingly. These changes have eventually played an important role to generate the power shift between the two countries. Let me discuss this law from two aspects. One is from the impact of the performance of Japanese companies in China on Japan's domestic economy. And the other is from the structural change of Sino-Japanese lateral trade. First, as a result of a large amount of Japanese companies invested in China, their gains from China strengthened financial stabilities of their mother companies back in Japan. We can verify this by studying data from China and Japan, respectively. On the one hand, the Ministry of Commerce of China released data on January 23rd this year that despite of negative impacts caused by the nationwide anti-Japanese sentiment in China, the total amount of Japanese companies' investment in China was $7.4 billion in 2012, and 16% increase from the previous year. On the Japan side, the data from Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry of Japan showed that the share of profit from local subsidiaries of Japanese companies, such as Toyota, Honda, Nissan in China, to Japanese transportation equipment industry's domestic profit was 35.3% in 2010. Second, the structure of Sino-Japanese bilateral trade has experienced a dramatic change, and the share of inter-industrial trade has increased substantially. Until recent year, the bilateral trade had followed the exact prediction of the theory of comparative advantage. That was the time when China exported the labor and the resource-intensive products to China. Japan mainly exported capital goods to China. In the past few years, however, the pattern of China's export to Japan changed. Military and transportation-related equipment surpassed labor-intensive goods to become the #1 exported commodity to Japan. This change indicates that the rapid economic development in the past 30 decades has not only enhanced China's production capacity, but also improved its competitiveness in manufactured products and, as a result, pulled up China's status on the global supply chain. Given that more than half of China's exports are provided by foreign companies, improvement in competitiveness of China's export goods should not be fully counted as China's advantage, but its psychological impact on boosting China's nationalism is no doubt counted. It's my presentation end. Thank you.
Okay, a very insightful presentation. Explained the different perspectives about the many aspects of this tension. So